And clear of the closing doors, please.
No, they ain't closed yet.
Our little film set. Yes.
I think schools, as we've allowed them to become institutional, are the major stabilizing force in countries like yours and mine, in which they are a prominent part of daily life. They're a major stabilizing force, but we have to question whether some of the aspects of our societies are worth stabilizing. The sharp social class distinctions, the sharp economic distinctions, in my own philosophy, aren't worthy of stabilizing, and yet schools do that. Schools also stabilize the world as we're familiar with it, rather than drawing out the very best in everybody, which would give us a civil society that's unpredictable. What would happen? Schools train people to fit into the existing civil society. Think of the civil society in Sweden in the 16th century, or the 13th century, or the 11th, when you practiced human sacrifice. And if those societies had been stabilized, it certainly would have been a much different Sweden than you live in today. There was enough room to slowly and incrementally, step by step, alter the destiny of a society. But when mass institutional schooling came along, it drew all the children out of the community, and it fixed largely, not totally of course, but largely it fixed the way the kids would see values, the way they would see one another. And by the time you release them, although Sweden, if I understand correctly, is probably a good deal better about this than the United States, by the time kids are released from the schooling experience, they're so bent to habit patterns and attitudes that very few of them deviate for the rest of their lives. I think as a school teacher, teaching in a classroom for 30 years, that's a horrible thing, because we alienate a great number of these kids from themselves, and we absolutely guarantee that whatever their innate genius and talents are is very unlikely to be developed efficiently, because our principal agenda is to have a certain battery of facts and attitudes memorized so deeply. That's what testing is about. Memorized so deeply that we can predict the future. And not to be long-winded, but continue the idea, try to imagine a commercial society that could not predict what you're going to eat, wear, want in the future. It would be flying blind when women's clothing suddenly turns purple. It doesn't happen on the basis of a whim of a fashion designer, but on a basis of careful market testing of whether people are ready to shift from fuchsia, or red rather, and then the propaganda machine is geared up, and in Sweden as in the United States, the right people begin to wear purple, the right television people or film people or whoever your version of rock stars are, and then suddenly all the store windows are full of purple, and we get rid of our red clothing, even though it's brand new. Schools create an attitude that I'm sure is perceived by everybody, but what isn't perceived, I think, as universally is it's a negative attitude that's absolutely essential for a commercial community to flourish in, and that is an attitude of low-level dissatisfaction, so that nothing you acquire, an automobile, a suit, a dress, nothing you acquire satisfies for very long. You discard it or put it in the back of the closet long before its use is over. And in fact, if you have machinery that runs around the clock and is only efficient if it can be run on multiple shifts, you have to have a population that's easily bored, that does not reflect or contemplate, that doesn't discipline themselves about their appetites. As your audience can see, I don't discipline myself about my appetites because I'm a good American there. Without schooling, this training, which takes 7, 10, 12 years to set in, how would it occur? It would occur indifferently and in a much weaker form than it does now. School is a habit training mechanism. Schooling is a form of adoption. You give your kid away at his or her most plastic years to a group of strangers. You accept a promise, sometimes stated and more often implied, that the state, through its agents, knows better how to raise your children and educate them than you, your neighbors, your grandparents, your local traditions do. And that your kid will be better off so adopted. By the time the child returns to the family or has the option of doing that, very few want to. Their parents are some form of friendly stranger too, and why not? In the key hours of growing up, strangers have reared the kid. Now let's look at the strangers, of which you were one and I was one. Regardless of our good feeling toward children, regardless of our individual talents or intelligence, we have so little time each day with each of these kids, we can't possibly know enough vital information about that particular kid to tailor a set of exercises to that kid. Oh, some of us, will try more than others, but there simply isn't any time to do it to a significant degree. So what we do is accept, and of course if we don't accept this, we're fired or harassed. We accept a state's prescription that's written in manuals. You do this first, and this second, and this third, and here you have a little latitude to talk to the kids. And the way the state checks on whether you've followed that diet is there's standardized tests given at intervals. If your kids do badly, it does not mean that they're bad readers or anything else. It means that they haven't been obedient to the drills the state set down, and they're marked for further treatment later on, or they're marked to be excluded from responsible jobs. Perhaps some ways by being excluded from the colleges that lead to responsible jobs, in other ways from the licenses that lead to responsible jobs. This was all worked out. It didn't evolve by a lot of rational people saying, we'll take this, this, and this from the past, then the next generation will take this, this, and this. This was set down largely in a handful of places. Prussia was perhaps the most prominent of those places. And the Prussian experiment leaped into the United States almost immediately in the 1840s, leaped into the United States. Its propagandists covered the country here. Its backers, its financial backers, set up the most important teacher training institutes and financed those institutes. And then no one was allowed to become a teacher who didn't more or less subscribe to the fact that experts could create a curriculum and pedagogues could administer it. Well, that's exactly what Horace, the Roman essayist, talked about in several of his essays. He said, the master creates the lessons. The pedagogue, the teacher, administers the lessons. But if you find the teacher creating the lessons or deviating from the direction those lessons are headed in, you get rid of the pedagogue. But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, and they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia. Now let's shift to the basis of your question, which is Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. These people saw a different kind of utopia through solving the problem of production with high-speed machinery. They saw that material abundance could be created, and that want, first of all, of course, they thought they could become supremely wealthy, which they did. But secondarily, they weren't beasts. They thought that this material abundance, since they had abandoned a belief in a creator or an afterlife, this material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. If you gave children and families options, it probably would take half a decade before many people tried the options. But I think inside of a decade, the institutional schools would vanish because they don't teach the way children learn, nor can they teach the way children learn. That's not what they're set up to do. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands. Your theorists, through history, were the first to reflect on the best, most efficient ways to manage populations. And your theorists worked out state institutions very early on. I'll give you one example that caused the socialization of populations and the stratification of populations to take place, I won't say indelibly, but certainly to an extreme degree, very early on in the 17th and by the middle of the 18th century, the stratifications across Europe were perfect, and there was no way really to escape unless you were a highly unusual person and you could see through a lot of the constraints on us, a lot of the strings that hold us like puppets are really inventions of our own mind. I'm not saying that there aren't armies and police and various ways to punish deviants, but there isn't any way to punish a large number of deviants. There isn't any way to do that. It's too expensive to even try to do it unless you can colonize the minds of children growing up so they become their own police. And they will report other children who are deviating. It's so efficient, it's so cost effective, and Europe worked this out very, very early. Let me give you one example, since most of you are Lutheran. And that's fine, that's fine. The Lutheran religion is one of the Episcopal religions, like the British state religion of Anglicanism. Lutheranism is another way to make the head of the political state God's agent on earth. Now notice what the significance of that is. If the head of the political state is God's representative on earth, then all the priests or ministers or bishops are duty-bound to report deviation from the state policy right through the ranks of the church to the highest ranks, and those high ranks report to the head of the political state. In Luther's Germany, there were well over 100 separate principalities. It was a madhouse. Probably was one of the finest times in human history, because you could walk across the street or the river and they were doing it a different way. Yeah, I know I'm simplifying this, but when I get to what Luther did to revolutionize and set the stage for the unification of all these 100 or 150 Germanies, I think you'll see where I'm going. Luther approached key princes, and he said, since he was a rebel against the Catholic Church and had been a Catholic priest, he said the key to the Catholic Church's penetration of the minds and lives of families all over Europe and the Russias is this, that the parish priest has the ability to use some of the church funds for charity, so that if these families aren't going to have a Christmas dinner, it's supplied by the church. And if this bright little kid should get training in watchmaking and he can't afford an apprenticeship, then the parish priest living close to his congregation can do this. He said, what you need to do is appropriate all the social services that the Catholic Church is now delivering to local priests, and to vest these in the political state, so that welfare still exists and schooling still exists, etc., etc. But you now supplicate the political state rather than, he said, that will destroy the powerful hold of the church. And that was, in fact, done in Prussia, in Hanover, in Saxony. It spread through the German states, and the idea spread through Scandinavia. Not that the Scandinavians didn't have their own spins on this, but the idea that the state was the proper father. Even the term fatherland, I don't know if it exists in Swedish, but it's motherland over here, but it's fatherland there. Yeah. So the state is the father. And if parents deviate from the state's wisdom, they should be disciplined. And if they deviate too far, then the family should be permanently split up and the children given to someone who will be trustworthy. That's the beginning of, I think, the empire of Europe, where bit by bit the national sovereignties of the key countries, the most powerful countries, have been eaten away by supranational agencies. And schooling is the principal vehicle. A project was launched in the last quarter of the 19th century in England with powerful help from a few American families who believed that the separation of the two countries had been the worst event in human history, and they wanted to work toward a long-term reintegration of Britain, the whole English-speaking world, as one country. That was their goal of the agenda, and they knew this would take quite a long time. And I'm going to give your listeners a reference that will be from an impeccable source that traces the growth of this thing. So the idea was to bring about a globe under the direction of people who had been reared as the British upper classes had been reared, to be the fathers and protectors of lesser mortals. The idea came about partially from Charles Darwin's first cousin, a famous intellectual named Galton, Francis Galton. And the idea would be that the attitudes, the values that had been forged by the British upper classes, and the kind of society that they had tempered and designed, could become the clothing for the entire globe. And it would take time. I mean, one of the big things would be a common currency and a common language, but they knew that would be a long way off. So they began by setting up 23 bases all over the planet. Now, all those bases are still in business. The one in the United States is right up on 66th Street. It's called the Council on Foreign Relations. And they have different names in different places. But the idea was to draw into that club the best, the brightest, and the most influential people from the entire country, from all races and all walks of life, and to use those people as the resonator of the idea of globalization. And at some generation, not impossibly far in the future, everyone would live pretty much the same, think pretty much the same, eat pretty much the same. There would be colorful differences between Swedes and Americans, and you'd save those for folk festivals once a year, or from international food festivals. But essentially, you could predict people, whether they were Swedes, Italians, Americans, Nigerians. You could predict them because they all would have been processed the same way. The vehicle, not the sole vehicle, because all vehicles, including mass media, were to be brought into this effort, but the principal vehicle was forced schooling. Forced because you didn't want to leave an option open for most kids. The entire account of this is set down in a wonderfully scholarly book that has 12 or 13 or even 1,400 pages, written by the personal tutor of President Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, at Georgetown University. Was a history professor, a professor of international government named Quigley. The first name, Roland? Oh, he's not there. I think his name's Carol Quigley. Well, the book's available to get. Quigley was a historian's historian, and his reputation to this day is of the very highest. And but the only people who ever hear of him are professional historians there. Quigley wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. If you get a copy of this book, you're in the hands of a scholar, and you've got 1,300 pages ahead of you of small print, dense pages, but I guarantee you will never be the same when you emerge on the other side. So rather than think of this as a way to oppress the poor, think of it this way. Once Charles Darwin wrote his second famous book, not Origin of Species, but The Descent of Man, which was published in England a little bit before this and in the United States in 1871, Darwin refined his theory of evolution. I hope you all know that Darwin was not an academic professor. What Darwin thought got circulated in drawing rooms all over the world before any academics heard of this. And Darwin's second famous book, Descent of Man, introduced into the community of the powerful in Europe and the United States as profound an idea as I've ever been able to track in human history. It was simply this: not everyone is evolving. A very small fraction of the human race is evolving. Everybody else is an evolutionary dead end. He particularly fingered the Irish, but you know, he spread around is an evolutionary dead end, and the principle he had discovered scientifically was that if evolutionarily advanced stock crossbred with the dead ends, that evolution would march backwards into the swirling mists of the dawnless past. There. Well, suppose you were a person of substance, or even a leading academic, and you had taken the burden of civilization on your shoulders, and you knew that 95% of the human race were dead ends. But now, what would be incumbent on you to do as a responsible person if you thought most people could ruin this march toward human perfection? Well, when Andrew Carnegie, but a lot of people, cooked up different additions to this plan. One of the things that was cooked up was to have forced institutional schooling that layered people so that they competed with one another, and the good breeding stock could be reserved at the very top of that pyramid, and usually in elite private boarding schools is where it's reserved. But there are some segments of public schools where it's reserved. Everybody else is set against each other's throats with these microscopic differences measured by completely invalid tests. I hope that's the right statistical word. But what I mean is the tests don't actually measure what they say they measure. If the tests say, for example, that you're a brilliant reader, it's almost predictable that you're not a brilliant reader. What you can do is go to a reading selection, and with 6, 7, or 8 kinds of information, you can quickly gloss the section, remove that piece of information, and check something on a multiple choice test. If anyone asks you a complex question about their reading selection, you don't know what they're talking about. They can answer factual questions, but they can't answer questions that ask them to gauge the significance or the relationship of characters, anything that requires what we might call higher order thinking, they can't answer. They can retrieve bits of information and check it off on a checklist. A portion of their brains had been removed. How? By increasing the frequency of these tests from first grade on to the point where what passed for an education was doing well on these tests, and maybe in a secondary sense, getting a pat on the head from the teacher, having the teacher call your little hand and wiggle in the air until somebody else is there. But nothing replaced doing well on those tests. So, as anybody with a good mind would do, even if they're not sure what's going on, they deduce the right strategy to follow. Why waste your time reflecting on things when you're only going to be asked these 6 or 7 kinds of information over and over and over again, right through college? And if you do well, your parents and other people, authorities tell you, well, there are places reserved for you, and eventually a place is reserved in medical school. Darwin says it's ordained by biology. You can't escape the slot you're put in, and if you try to escape, you'll pollute the person in the upper rank. They won't drag you up, you'll drag them down, and eventually, if enough people do that, all history will reverse itself and march backward, and it's already happening in Ireland. You didn't like the Irish. Among the ways that's done is to stratify very strictly schooling, to keep kids in schooling long enough that their ties to other forms of strength, their community, their tradition, their parents, their older brother, are so weakened that the authority, first in the form of a school teacher and a principal, and then in the form of all the voices who give orders, the people don't know how to bulk authority. And you show them enough examples of people whose lives were destroyed by doing that, that fear is the fuel that runs the evolutionarily retarded, keeping themselves in place forever. Now, this case is presented. It's not presented as succinctly as I said. You put this together like a mosaic from this event and that event and this event that doesn't, no one of which seem to make any sense. It's when they're all together and seen as a way to order the management of the human race and make it predictable, then you see that it's a tool of management theory, that some people learn to do higher order numbers and higher order literacies is necessary. Those people will be, if they're behaving themselves, they'll be vested with transmitting this to the next generation. But that most of us must be kept ignorant of the plan, addicted to punching buttons or watching television, addicted to our simple pleasures of pizza and a gallon of beer, and then we go to sleep and wake up and we punch buttons, is necessary to manage the kind of economy that these people created.